Hello everyone, and welcome to Level Up Your English. Today, I'm going to read you a story. The story is called The Queen Who Never Smiled. This is an advanced English story perfect for C1 to C2 learners. So relax, listen carefully, and enjoy the story. Let's begin. The Queen Who Never Smiled. In the northernmost part of the world, beyond the pine forests and the black lakes, there stood a palace of pale stone that seemed, from a distance, less like a home than a thought someone had carved into the side of a mountain. It belonged to Queen Elowin. Her kingdom was prosperous. The roads were safe, the granaries were full, the markets were lively, and no enemy had crossed her borders in 20 years. The people spoke her name with respect. Some even spoke it with love. And yet, throughout the kingdom, from the fishermen by the frozen coast to the merchants in the southern valleys, one thing was said again and again: the queen has never smiled. It was not merely that she smiled rarely. No living soul, as far as anyone could remember, had ever seen even the slightest trace of amusement, warmth, or softness touch her mouth. Her face was neither cruel nor severe, but calm in that distant, unreadable manner one sometimes finds in statues or saints. Children were told not to make noise if the royal carriage passed through their town. Musicians played carefully in her presence and never dared improvise. Courtiers rehearsed their jokes before dinner, only to abandon them the moment she entered the hall, for fear that any attempt at lightness might die in the air between them and fall to the marble floor. There were, naturally, theories. Some said she had been born beneath an unlucky star. Some said she had once loved a man who had betrayed her. Some believed that when she was a child, a winter spirit had stolen her laughter and hidden it somewhere beneath the snow. The oldest servants, however, said nothing at all, and those who say nothing often know the most. In the 12th year of her reign, when Queen Elowin was 32 years old, a traveling storyteller arrived at the palace gates. He came not in silk or velvet, but in a weather-darkened coat, with a satchel over one shoulder and a walking stick of ash wood in his hand. His boots were dusty, his hair threaded with silver, and his face bore the patient expression of a man who had spent more time observing fires than sitting beside them. His name was Lucian Vale. When the guards asked his business, he replied, "I have come to make the queen smile." The younger guard laughed immediately. The older one did not. "You are not the first to try," said the older guard. "I know," Lucian answered. "And the others failed." "Yes. Then why should we admit you?" Lucian lifted his shoulders slightly. "Because failure, though common, is not always permanent." There was something in the quiet certainty with which he said this that unsettled the guards just enough for them to report him rather than send him away. By evening, the matter had reached the queen herself. Elowin was in the Western Library when her chamberlain informed her that yet another ambitious fool wished to perform before her. She did not look up from the document she was reading. "A juggler?" she asked. "No, Your Majesty." "A poet?" "No, Your Majesty." She turned a page. "Then what?" "A storyteller." This made her pause, though only for an instant. The chamberlain noticed. "Shall I dismiss him?" Elowin considered the fire, which was burning low in the grate. Outside, snow moved lightly against the high windows like pale dust. The night promised to be long. At last, she said, "Let him stay. He may speak tomorrow." The next evening, the great hall was fuller than it had been in months. Nobles who had not attended supper in weeks suddenly felt obliged to appear. Ladies with jeweled hairpins leaned toward one another in bright expectation. Ministers adopted expressions of polite doubt. Even the servants seemed to move with unusual alertness, as if the possibility of witnessing history had entered the palace disguised as a rumor. Lucian Vale stood at the center of the hall, alone except for the silence around him. Queen Elowyn sat upon the raised seat at the far end of the room, beneath a canopy of dark blue velvet embroidered with silver stars. She wore no crown, only a narrow band of black metal set with a single white stone. Her hands rested upon the arms of her chair. Her face revealed nothing. Lucian bowed. "You claim," said the Queen, "that you can do what no one else has done." "I claim only that I can tell a story," he said. A faint murmur passed through the court. Elowyn inclined her head. "Then begin." Lucian did not pace the room or raise his voice theatrically. He simply began to speak, and in speaking transformed the hall. He told of a giant who collected bells because he was afraid of silence. He told of a fox who pretended to be a priest in order to steal chickens from a monastery. He told of a duchess who fell in love with a portrait painter and spent 10 years pretending to hate him because she preferred longing to disappointment. Some stories were absurd enough to draw laughter from half the room. Others were so sharp in their observations that listeners laughed before they realized they had been gently insulted. But Queen Elowyn did not smile. She listened. She did not appear bored. Once or twice, she even seemed more attentive than before, yet her face remained as untouched as winter glass. Lucian noticed. He also noticed something else. Whenever a story approached a certain kind of ending, something tender perhaps, or intimate, something in which one soul truly reached another, a barely visible tension entered the Queen's expression, and her gaze shifted ever so slightly away, as if she were looking not at him, but at some place behind him that no one else could see. When he finished, the court applauded warmly. Queen Elowyn raised one hand, and the sound ended at once. "You are skilled. You may stay at the palace for 3 nights. At the end of that time, if you still wish to continue your experiment, you may tell me another story." That was all, yet Lucian bowed as though he had been given a greater gift than gold. The next 2 days, he walked through the palace and spoke to almost no one directly about the Queen. Instead, he watched. He listened. He asked simple questions that appeared unimportant. Where does Her Majesty walk in the mornings? Which rooms does she never enter? Who served her as a child? What became of the old music tutor? And finally, late on the 2nd evening, in a narrow servants' passage behind the old chapel, he found the person he had been hoping to meet. Her name was Marta. She had once been the Queen's nurse, and though age had bent her back and dimmed one eye, nothing had weakened the authority of her voice. When Lucian asked whether the Queen had always been as she was now, Marta studied him for a long while before replying. "No," she said at last, "not always." Then what changed? Marta looked down the corridor to ensure they were alone. "When she was 9, she said quietly, "the palace was warmer than it is now. There was music here. There were flowers in winter. The king, her father, was not a cheerful man, but when he looked at her, he softened. The Queen, her mother, laughed often, and the child herself," Marta paused, "the child laughed at everything. Rain on windows, dogs falling asleep in sunlight, ink stains, mispronounced words. She had the kind of joy that embarrasses adults. And then, Marta's hands tightened around the candle she was holding. There was a fire. Lucian said nothing. It began in the old southern wing just after midnight. No one knows whether it came from a dropped lamp or a cracked chimney, and now it hardly matters. Smoke filled the corridors. There was confusion, shouting, locked doors, missing keys. Marta's voice thinned. By the time they reached the Queen's apartments, it was too late. The Queen's mother died. Marta nodded. And the child? She was found outside the room, wrapped in a blanket, unable to speak. The king lived another 6 years, but something in him froze that night, and something in her, she stopped, was broken. Lucian suggested gently. Marta shook her head. No, broken things can be mended. It was buried. The next evening, Lucian returned to the great hall. Again the court assembled. Again the queen sat beneath the silver stars. This time Lucian did not begin with giants or foxes. Instead, he told the story of a kingdom where winter lasted too long. In that kingdom, he said, there had once been an orchard that bloomed even in frost, because a queen walked there every morning and spoke to the trees as if they were frightened children. When she died, the orchard withered. Years later, her daughter became ruler, and though she governed wisely, nothing flowered near her, not because she was cold, but because all growing things sensed that somewhere beneath her composure there remained a season she had never survived. The hall became very still. No one moved, no one coughed. Lucian continued. In the story, the daughter queen spent years trying to be perfect, measured, graceful, impenetrable, because she had learned too early that grief invites spectators, and spectators make grief unbearable. So she buried not only her sorrow, but also the laughter that had once lived beside it, for fear that if she opened one chamber of the heart, all the others might flood at once. Now Elowyn was no longer merely attentive, she was staring at him. Her face had not changed, but something dangerous had entered the air, like the charged silence before a storm. Lucian went on, though his voice softened. Then, one winter evening, a stranger came to the palace and said to the queen, "You were not wrong to close the door. You were only wrong to believe it must remain closed forever." At that, a murmur ran through the room like a ripple across dark water. Queen Elowyn rose. The entire hall seemed to recoil. "How dare you?" she said. Her voice was not loud. That made it worse. No one in the court had ever seen anger in her before, and because it had been stored for so long, it emerged not as shouting, but as precision. Lucian bowed his head slightly. Because no one else would. The queen descended the steps from her seat. Jewels flickered at her throat. Her expression was no longer empty. It was alive with something far more terrible. "You come into my hall and dress insolence as wisdom. You take fragments of a life you do not understand and shape them into performance." Yes, the honesty of the answer startled everyone, perhaps even the queen herself. He lifted his gaze to meet hers. "And I do so because everyone here fears your silence so deeply that they have begun to worship it. They call it dignity, they call it strength, they call it majesty. But grief can become a throne as easily as a tomb, and if no one dares speak to the woman beneath the crown, then the crown becomes a prison." No one in the hall seemed able to breathe. Elowyn stood utterly still. Then, to the amazement of every witness, she laughed. It was not graceful. It was not delicate. It was one sharp, disbelieving sound, almost more like a crack in ice than laughter. She pressed one hand to her mouth as if the sound had escaped without permission. The court stared. Lucian did not move. A second laugh came, quieter than the first, but fuller. Then another, and suddenly the queen, who had not smiled in all the memory of the kingdom, bent forward as laughter and tears arrived together, indistinguishable in their force. No one knew what to do. Some looked away, as if the moment were too private to witness. Some began to cry themselves. Marta, who had slipped into the hall unnoticed, covered her face with both hands. Elowyn straightened at last. There were tears on her cheeks, and for the first time in many years she looked not weaker, but younger. Not healed exactly, not transformed into a different woman, but undeniably human. She looked at Lucian with astonishment, as though he had not given her something new, but returned something stolen long ago. "What was so amusing?" she asked, breath unsteady. Lucian's eyes warmed. "The part," he said, "where a whole kingdom mistook surviving for living." For a second she stared at him. Then she smiled. Not politely, not faintly, but fully, helplessly, radiantly, with all the brigness that had once belonged to the child she had buried beneath duty, silence, and winter. And because one honest smile can alter the architecture of an entire world, the hall itself seemed to change. People smiled back before they could stop themselves. The fire appeared warmer. The painted saints on the chapel doors seemed less severe. Even the night beyond the windows looked less like emptiness and more like distance. Later, stories would spread through every village and port in the kingdom. Some said the storyteller had used magic. Some said he had insulted the queen into laughter. Some said he had reminded her of her mother. All of them were wrong, though not entirely. What he truly done was simpler and more difficult. He had spoken to the sorrow she had hidden and refused to be frightened when it answered. Lucian Vale did not remain at court forever. Men like him rarely do. By the first thaw of spring, he was gone. But after that winter, there was music in the palace again. The southern gardens were reopened. The queen still governed with intelligence and restraint, but now, from time to time, laughter was heard through the high windows of the western rooms. Not often, not carelessly, but enough for the people to understand that joy had not been forbidden, only delayed. And in the years that followed, when children asked whether the old story was true, whether there had really once been a queen who never smiled, their parents would answer, yes, but that was before someone reminded her that a heart may survive by turning to stone, and yet it only begins to live again when it dares to break. All right, that was the story, The Queen Who Never Smiled. I hope you enjoyed it. If some parts felt challenging, that's completely normal. Listen again and you will understand more each time. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Level Up Your English. See you in the next story.